The day Adelaide Underwood walked into the Harding County Courthouse with a rolled-up water claim in her fist and fire in her dark eyes, every man in that dusty room held his breath, because they all knew she was about to do something that could get her killed. It was the spring of 1882, deep in the territory of New Mexico, where the land was the color of burnt copper and the sky stretched overhead like a faded blue quilt. The town of Redstone sat along the Rio Salado, a modest river that cut through the valley like a silver thread holding the whole dry country together. Water was not merely a resource out here. It was survival. It was power. And the man who controlled it controlled everything and everyone within a 50-mile radius. That man was Cornelius Holt. He was 62 years old, wide-shouldered, with a face carved from decades of sun and ruthlessness. He owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, a ranch that spread across 40,000 acres of grazing land east of Redstone. He owned the bank. He had the county judge, a man named Elias Prout, in his back pocket, and every lawman who wore a star in Harding County had been either appointed by Holt or was too afraid of him to act against him. 3 years ago, Holt had begun diverting the Rio Salado upstream, redirecting its flow through a series of constructed earthen channels that funneled the bulk of the water onto his own land. Downstream, smaller farms and homesteads had watched their irrigation ditches go dry, their crops wither, and their wells drop lower every season. Adelaide Underwood's husband, Thomas, had spent the last year of his life trying to organize the smaller farmers against Holt's water grab. He had written letters to the territorial government in Santa Fe. He had filed formal complaints with the county clerk. He had spoken at town meetings with passion and evidence and careful legal argument. And then in October of 1881, Thomas Underwood had died. Everyone in Redstone said it was a fall from his horse on the Ridge Road. The horse had come back without him, and his body had been found at the base of a drop with a broken neck. Adelaide had stood over her husband's grave in the thin autumn light and told herself she believed that. She had a son to raise, a farm to keep, and grief that pressed down on her chest like a stone. She could not afford to believe anything else, not yet. But she kept Thomas's papers. She kept his survey records, his correspondence with the Territorial Land Office, and the original deed to the Underwood claim, which included riparian water rights stretching back to the original grant of 1868. Thomas had been building a case, and the evidence was all there in a cedar box under the floorboards of their farmhouse. When the last of winter released its grip on the valley that spring, and Adelaide looked out over her fields to see the irrigation ditch running barely a trickle, she made her decision. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair that she wore pinned at the back of her neck and gray eyes that missed nothing. Her hands were rough from farm work, and her dress was plain calico, patched at the elbows, but she carried herself like a woman who had calculated exactly how much she was willing to lose and had decided the answer was nothing more. She filed the water claim on a Tuesday morning, walking into the county clerk's office with Thomas's documentation in hand and laying it on the counter with a flat, deliberate sound. The clerk, a thin young man named Dobbs, went pale when he read the name on the deed. "Mrs. Underwood," he said carefully, "you understand that this claim challenges the diversion rights registered by the Holt Land and Cattle Company." "I understand exactly what it challenges," she said. "There's going to be a hearing. I expect there will be. Judge Prout presides over water hearings." "I know who the judge is," she said. "File the claim, Mr. Dobbs. That is your job." He filed it. The hearing was set for the following Friday, which was the 17th of March, 1882. Word spread through Redstone like a brush fire. Adelaide Underwood was challenging Cornelius Holt. There were those who admired her for it. There were those who thought she had lost her mind from grief. And there were those, men who had done business with Holt for years, who quietly hoped she might succeed at the thing none of them had ever dared attempt. 3 days before the hearing, a writer came to her farm. He was not one of Holt's men. Adelaide knew all of Holt's men by sight, a collection of hard-faced cowboys and former army irregulars who rode in pairs and wore their guns low on their hips. This man rode alone on a bay horse that was travel-worn but well-kept, and he wore a duster coat the color of storm clouds, dark brown with trail dust at the hem. He pulled up at her fence gate and removed his hat, which was something Holt's men never did. "Mrs. Underwood," he said. She was standing on her porch with a shotgun resting across the crook of her arm, not aimed at him but present. "Who's asking?" "My name is Harvey Sheridan," he said. "I rode in from Las Cruces 2 days ago. I heard about your water claim at the saloon last night, and I've been doing some thinking." He was perhaps 35, tall in the saddle, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a face that was lean and weathered but not unkind. His eyes were the particular shade of brown that looks almost amber in direct sunlight, and they had a steadiness to them, a quality of seeing things clearly and holding what they saw without flinching. "Thinking about what?" she asked. "About whether I could be of some use to you," he said. "I used to practice law in Kansas City. Before things went sideways on me, I was a pretty decent attorney." She looked at him for a long moment. "What went sideways?" He returned her gaze without evasion. "I had a case against a railroad company. They had influence over the court and I lost. And then I kept pushing and I lost more than the case. I've been riding west for about 2 years. "A disbarred attorney," she said. "I resigned before they could disbar me," he said. "There's a difference, and it matters to me, even if it doesn't legally matter at all." Something honest flickered across his face when he said it, a kind of wry self-awareness that she found surprising. Most men in his position would have told her only the flattering version. "I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not looking for someone else to fight my battles," she said. "Thomas did most of the legal work already. I have his research." "Then maybe you just need someone to stand beside you," Harvey said quietly. "Because Holt is going to have 4 lawyers in that room, and you are going to be standing alone. And it doesn't matter how good your evidence is if you don't know how to present it in a way that withstands what they're going to throw at it." She studied him for another moment, then lowered the shotgun and opened the gate. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee." He tied his horse at the post and followed her into the farmhouse. Her son, a boy of 8 named Eli, was sitting at the kitchen table doing arithmetic on a slate board. He looked up at Harvey with the frank assessment that children apply to strangers, decided apparently that he posed no immediate threat, and returned to his numbers. Harvey sat down across from the boy while Adelaide poured coffee, and he glanced at the slate. "That a multiplication problem?" he asked. "Long division," Eli said without looking up. "Ma says arithmetic is the most important subject." "Your ma is right," Harvey said. Adelaide set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. She pulled the cedar box from the shelf beside the stove and opened it. For the next 3 hours, Harvey Sheridan read every document Thomas Underwood had assembled. And as he read, Adelaide watched his face and tried to determine whether this stranger was exactly what he appeared to be or something else entirely. What she saw was a man who read carefully, who occasionally asked questions that were precise and intelligent, and who handled Thomas's papers with a respect she had not expected. He set each document back in the order he had found it. He did not make assumptions. When he finished reading the last letter, he set it down and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment. "Your husband built a strong case," he said. "The original deed is clear. The riparian rights predate Holt's diversion by 13 years. "I know that," she said. "The problem isn't the evidence. The problem is that Judge Pruitt is going to look for any procedural reason to dismiss this before the substance can even be argued. Holt's lawyers will challenge the standing of a widow to bring a water claim on behalf of her deceased husband's deed. The deed transferred to my name when Thomas died. I am the holder of record." "Yes, and that should be sufficient, but they'll argue that the claim was filed under terms of marital property law that requires." He stopped himself and looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "You've already thought of this." "I've thought of all of it," she said. "What I haven't thought of is how to make 12 men sit in that room and actually listen, when half of them owe their livelihoods to Cornelius Holt. Harvey was quiet again for a moment. Outside, the late afternoon wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the sound of it filled the kitchen with a dry, whispering restlessness. "You need someone in that room who doesn't owe anything to Holt and can't be pressured into silence," he said. "Are you volunteering?" "I'm saying I can stand in that room and speak the legal argument clearly and without fear, because Holt has no leverage over me. I have nothing he can threaten." She looked at him steadily. "Why do you want to do this?" The question landed in the room and stayed there, deserving an honest answer. Harvey set down his cup and looked out the kitchen window at the dry fields beyond, where the irrigation ditch ran thin and brown and low. "Because I've spent 2 years riding away from things," he said, "and I'm tired of it. Because your husband was right and you are right and the law was made to protect exactly this kind of claim. And because I watched a court be bought once and I would rather stand in a room and say a thing is wrong even if no one listens than keep riding past." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You can sleep in the barn. There's a clean cot in the tack room. I won't have you sleeping in the house." "I wouldn't expect it," he said. "And if you're planning to run away with my papers or cause me any other kind of trouble, you should know that I am a very accurate shot." "I don't doubt it," he said, and this time the beginning of a smile became an actual brief smile that changed his face entirely, softened the weathered lines of it, made him look younger and more unguarded than he'd let himself appear since he rode up. She almost smiled back. She caught herself and didn't, but she noticed it. The next 2 days passed in a strange kind of intense companionship that Adelaide had not experienced before. Harvey worked at the kitchen table for hours at a stretch, organizing Thomas's evidence into a coherent legal argument and preparing responses to the procedural challenges he anticipated Holt's lawyers would raise. Adelaide worked beside him because she had understood every page of Thomas's research and could answer Harvey's questions faster and more precisely than any law clerk could have. Eli moved between the barn and the kitchen with the cheerful indifference of a child accustomed to strange adults appearing in his life, and he had decided by the second morning that Harvey was worthy of a limited confidence, which he expressed by showing Harvey the 3 arrowheads he had collected from the creek. Harvey examined each one with genuine attention, turning them in his fingers. "These are Mescalero Apache," he said. "See the chipping pattern along the edge? That's distinctive to their work." Eli's eyes widened. "You know about Apache arrowheads?" "I spent some time in the territory before I came here, long enough to learn a few things." He handed the arrowheads back carefully. "Keep those safe. They're history." Adelaide, standing at the stove, heard this exchange and felt something shift slightly in her chest, not dramatically, just a small, quiet movement like a door opening a crack to let in a thin line of light. That evening, after Eli was in bed, she and Harvey sat on the porch in the warm spring darkness and went over the argument one final time. The night around them was enormous and starred, the kind of New Mexico sky that made a person feel both small and somehow part of something larger than themselves. Adelaide had a cup of tea and Harvey had a second coffee, and they talked through every point and counterpoint until they were both satisfied that the argument was as strong as they could make it. There was a long pause, the kind that falls naturally between people who have spent all their words on the necessary things and find themselves left with a different kind of silence. "Did you have a family?" Adelaide asked. "In Kansas City." Harvey turned the coffee cup in his hands. "No, there was a woman for a while. But the work I was doing, the railroad case, it consumed everything. She moved on, I understood it." "Did you?" He glanced at her sideways, and there was something in the glance, a directness that was almost startling. "No," he admitted. "Not at the time, but I do now." Adelaide looked out at the dark fields. "Thomas and I were not a love story the way people talk about love stories," she said quietly. "We respected each other enormously. We built something together. When he died, I lost my partner more than I lost my romance." She paused. "I'm not sure if that makes the grief smaller or larger." "Maybe both at different times," Harvey said. She looked at him. He was looking at the stars with that steady quality she had noticed from the beginning, that quality of holding what he saw without flinching, and she thought that he was a man who had learned, through whatever particular suffering his life had given him, to be honest rather than comfortable. It was a quality she respected deeply, perhaps more than any other. "We should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be long." "It is," he agreed. He stood and took his coffee cup inside and set it on the table with care. And then he walked to the barn without making any more of the moment than it was, which Adelaide found she appreciated. She sat on the porch alone for a little while longer, listening to the cottonwoods and the distant sound of cattle and the high, thin cry of a coyote somewhere out on the mesa, and she told herself firmly that she had a water hearing to survive tomorrow, and she could not afford to feel anything unnecessary. She was not entirely successful. The morning of the hearing, Adelaide dressed in her best dress, a dark blue wool that had belonged to her mother, with a white collar she had freshly laundered. She pinned her hair back cleanly, and put on the good boots that Thomas had bought her for their 5th anniversary. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and saw a woman who looked entirely steady, which was not precisely how she felt. Harvey had been up before dawn. When she came out to the kitchen, he had coffee made and had already packed Thomas's documents in a leather satchel he had produced from his saddlebags. He was wearing a clean white shirt and a dark jacket that fit him well and looked like it had once been part of a respectable wardrobe. He had shaved. He looked, Adelaide thought, like exactly what he was, a man who had been a serious professional in another life and still carried that quality inside him, whatever the road had done to the outside. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. Eli came with them. Adelaide had considered leaving him with a neighbor, but Eli had looked at her with Thomas's particular brand of quiet stubbornness and said he wanted to be there, and she had thought that maybe he had earned that right. He sat between Adelaide and Harvey in the wagon as they drove the 4 miles into Redstone, and he did not fidget or talk but watched the road ahead with the gravity of a boy who understood something important was happening. The courthouse was a low adobe building on the main street, and when they arrived, Adelaide saw that the room inside was already crowded. Word had traveled through the valley, and there were 30 or 40 people packed onto the wooden benches, farmers and their wives, shopkeepers, the owner of the livery stable, the woman who ran the hotel laundry. These were the people downstream, the people whose fields had been drying for 3 years. At the front of the room, on one side of the long table, sat 4 men in dark suits. Holt's lawyers from Santa Fe, Adelaide assumed. They had the polished, impersonal look of men paid to win and not to care about the winning. Holt himself sat behind them, broad and still, his white hat on the table before him, watching Adelaide's entrance with eyes that were flat and measuring. Adelaide walked to the other side of the table and set down Thomas's satchel. Harvey took his place beside her. She heard the murmur that went through the room, not hostile exactly, but uncertain, the sound of people who had wanted to believe someone might stand up but had not quite believed until this moment that it was actually happening. Judge Elias Prout came in from the back door and took his seat at the raised bench. He was a small, dry man in his 50s, with a precisely trimmed mustache and the bearing of someone who had learned to perform authority in place of actually having it. His eyes moved to Holt's table with a small, involuntary flicker that told Adelaide everything Thomas had ever suspected about his loyalties. "This hearing is called to order," Prout said. "The matter before this court is the water claim filed by one Adelaide Underwood against the Holt Land and Cattle Company, concerning diversion rights on the Rio Salado as it passes through Section 14 of Harding County. Before we proceed to the substance of the claim, the court will hear any preliminary motions." The lead lawyer from Holt's table stood immediately. His name, Adelaide would learn, was Garland, and he was smooth and quick and entirely pleased with himself. "Your Honor, the Holt Land and Cattle Company moves to dismiss this claim on the grounds that the claimant lacks proper standing. The original deed and associated water rights were held by the late Thomas Underwood. Mrs. Underwood cannot demonstrate clear legal transfer of those rights under the territorial code. Harvey rose. Your Honor, the deed of record for the Underwood property in Section 14 was transferred to Adelaide Underwood upon the death of her husband under the terms of his registered will, probated in this county in November of 1881. The water rights attached to the land under riparian doctrine and transferred with the deed. The claimant's standing is unambiguous. I can provide the probate record, the deed of transfer, and the territorial statute governing riparian attachment. He laid all three documents on the judge's bench before Prout could respond. The judge looked at them with a careful blankness. Garland said, Your Honor, the question of riparian attachment in the case of a widow's inheritance is not settled under current territorial. It is settled, Harvey said, with a calm that was more powerful than force. The relevant statute is Section 47 of the Territorial Property Code, adopted in 1876. I have a certified copy here. I would invite Mr. Garland to show the court which specific provision he believes creates ambiguity, because I have read that statute carefully and I do not find one. There was a silence. Garland had not expected this. He had expected a grieving widow standing alone with a stack of papers she didn't know how to use. Prout cleared his throat. The court will take the standing question under brief advisement. Let us proceed to the substance of the claim. It was not a ruling in Adelaide's favor. But it was not a dismissal either. Harvey leaned toward her briefly and said under his breath, That's the best we could expect from him. Keep going. Adelaide nodded. She stood to present the substance of Thomas's claim, because she had known Thomas's argument better than anyone, and Harvey had coached her through exactly how to present it. She laid out the original deed, the survey records from 1868, the documented history of the Rio Salado's natural course, and then the evidence of Holt's diversion. The earthen dam constructed upstream in 1879, the channels redirecting the flow eastward, and the measurements Thomas had taken monthly for 2 years showing the downstream reduction. She spoke clearly and without trembling, which cost her more than she would have admitted. Each time Garland or one of the other Holt lawyers interrupted with an objection, Harvey was on his feet with the counter, precise and unhurried, citing statute and precedent with the fluency of a man who had spent years doing this and had not forgotten how. The room was very quiet. People were leaning forward on the benches. Holt sat without expression, but Adelaide noticed that his fingers, resting on the table before him, had tightened into a slow, controlled fist. Garland presented Holt's case, that the diversion had been approved by a county permit issued in 1879 and was therefore legally sanctioned, that the reduction in downstream flow was within acceptable limits under existing precedent, that the Underwood claim represented a speculative interpretation of rights that had never been legally tested. Harvey stood for the response. The county permit of 1879, he said, holding the document up clearly, was issued by the County Water Board, which at the time consisted of 3 members, 2 of whom held financial interests in Holt Land and Cattle Company. A permit issued by interested parties to benefit those same parties has no legal weight. Furthermore, the permit was issued without the public notice required by Territorial Code Section 31. It was never published in the Redstone Gazette or posted at the courthouse as required by law. I have affidavits from the Gazette editor confirming no such notice was ever received. He produced the affidavits. Garland stood. Those affidavits are not authenticated. They are notarized, Harvey said simply, laying them on the bench, by the same notary who authenticated the permit itself. If the notary's seal is good enough for the permit, it's good enough for the affidavits. Someone in the back of the room made a sound, not quite a laugh, but something close, the sound of a person watching a well-landed blow. Prout was visibly uncomfortable. He shuffled papers. He murmured with the court clerk. He looked at Holt's table with the expression of a man very much wishing someone would tell him what to do. And then Prout said the thing Adelaide had feared he would say. This court finds the substantive evidence compelling in some respects, he said carefully. But given the complexity of the competing claims and the county permit of 1879, this court requires additional time to review the applicable law. This hearing is continued for 30 days. Adelaide felt the room exhale with disappointment. A 30-day continuance was a delay tactic. Everyone in the room knew it, designed to give Holt time to apply pressure, to find ways to discourage or intimidate or simply wait out a widow who could not afford a prolonged legal fight. She was standing very still, keeping her face composed, when a voice came from the back of the room. It was quiet and steady, and carried without effort the way voices do when the speaker knows exactly what he means to say. "Your Honor, the law does not require 30 days to understand it." Everyone turned. In the back row of the packed room, a man was standing. He was perhaps 40 years old, with a rangy, sun-darkened look and the particular kind of stillness that comes to men who have spent a long time in difficult places. He wore no jacket, just a clean cotton shirt and working trousers, and he had the hands of someone who worked with them. But his voice, when he spoke, had an education underneath it. The evidence presented by Mrs. Underwood establishes prior riparian rights with documentation that predates the county permit by 11 years. The permit itself was issued without the required public notice, rendering it procedurally void under territorial statute. There is nothing complex here. Either the law means what it says, or it does not. Prout stared at him. "And who are you, sir?" "My name is Marcus Webb," the man said. "I am a licensed surveyor and I hold a commission from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. I was in Redstone last week on an unrelated survey matter, and I heard about this hearing, and I believe what Mrs. Underwood has presented is correct. If it would help this court, I can provide my own independent assessment of the Rio Salado diversion and its impact on the documented water rights in Section 14. There was a very long silence. Adelaide looked at Harvey. Harvey looked at Marcus Webb with an expression of controlled astonishment, and then something in his face settled into quiet gratitude. Holt's lawyer Garland was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Sit down, Mr. Garland," Prout said, surprising everyone, because the voice he used was not his usual cautious murmur but something flatter and more final, as if the entry of a territorial official into the room had suddenly shifted the calculus of the situation in ways Prout was rapidly calculating. A licensed surveyor from the Territorial Land Office was not a downstream farmer or a grieving widow. He was a representative of the government in Santa Fe, and whatever Holt's reach extended to within Harding County, it did not easily extend to Santa Fe, and Prout knew it. "Mr. Webb," Prout said, "this court would be grateful for any assessment you can provide." Marcus Webb walked to the front of the room. He produced from a worn leather case a set of survey maps that he had clearly prepared specifically for this hearing, and he laid them across the table with practiced efficiency. For 20 minutes he described the diversion in technical and precise terms: the measurements of the earthen dam, the redirected flow volumes, the documented reduction at the downstream points, and he concluded by saying, calmly and without drama, that the Rio Salado diversion as constructed by the Holt Land and Cattle Company reduced downstream flow to approximately 30% of the natural volume, which constituted a substantial impairment of prior riparian rights, and that in his professional opinion the permit of 1879 could not legally override those rights. When he finished, the room was so quiet that Adelaide could hear the wind outside. Prout looked at the evidence. He looked at Holt. He looked at the documents on his bench. And then, with the expression of a man doing a careful and private calculation about his own future, he made his ruling. "This court finds in favor of the claimant, Mrs. Adelaide Underwood. The water claim is upheld. The Holt Land and Cattle Company is ordered to restore the natural flow of the Rio Salado to not less than 70% of its documented historical volume within 60 days. The county permit of 1879 is voided due to procedural defect. This ruling is entered into the official record of Harding County." The room erupted. Adelaide stood very still in the middle of it, while around her people were standing, talking, reaching across to grip each other's arms, and she felt something release in her chest, something that had been held tight for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Not triumph, relief. The relief of a person who has been holding up an enormous weight and is finally allowed to set it down. She felt a hand at her elbow, steadying brief. She looked up. Harvey was standing beside her. His face was composed, but his eyes, those amber-brown eyes, were doing something she had not seen before. They were warm in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism or strategy or legal argument. He looked at her for just a moment, and then he looked away, and she thought with absolute clarity that she was not prepared for that. Cornelius Holt had stood from his chair. He was looking at Adelaide with an expression that was not, interestingly, rage. It was calculation, the look of a man reassessing a situation, determining new angles. He put on his white hat, very slowly and deliberately, and he walked out of the courthouse without a word, his lawyers trailing behind him like a weather front following a cold front, and the message in his silence was clear enough. This was not over. Adelaide knew it. Harvey knew it. The people in the room, still celebrating, mostly did not know it yet, or were choosing for this moment not to think about it. Marcus Webb came to shake Adelaide's hand. Up close he was a weathered, honest-looking man with a direct manner and the habit of looking at the ground beneath his feet as if he was always, even in a building, surveying it. "Your husband's research was excellent work," he said. "I came across some of his correspondence in the land office files in Santa Fe last autumn. It's why I stayed in Redstone when I heard about the hearing." "I'm grateful," Adelaide said, "more than I can say." "The law was on your side," Webb said. One just needed to say so out loud. He shook Harvey's hand too, and the two men exchanged a few quiet words, and then Webb gathered his maps and went out into the bright afternoon. Adelaide drove home with Eli beside her on the wagon seat. Harvey rode his bay horse alongside. For a long time nobody spoke, and the silence was comfortable, the silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to fill it immediately. Eli finally said, "We won." "Yes," Adelaide said. "Will Mr. Holt do something bad now?" There was a pause. Adelaide looked straight ahead at the road. "He might try," she said honestly. "But we'll be ready," Eli said. "Yes," Harvey said from horseback, and his voice had that same steady quality Adelaide had come to recognize, the quality of a man who meant what he said without ornament or exaggeration. "We'll be ready." The first indication that Holt intended to press back came 3 days later, when Adelaide found one of her fence lines cut and 3 of her cattle gone. She had been expecting something of the sort, but the actuality of it was still cold and ugly. She stood at the cut fence in the early morning, looking at the broken wire, and felt the familiar compression of anger and fear that she had been managing for years. Harvey had been staying in the barn, and he had talked about leaving more than once, in a vague way that Adelaide had noted with more attention than she had expressed. She had not asked him to stay. The question of what he was doing there had become subtly complicated, and she was managing that complication the same way she managed everything else, by keeping it contained and focused on the practical. He came out to the fence when he heard her, read the situation immediately, and said, "I'll ride to town and report it to the sheriff." "The sheriff won't do anything," she said. "Probably not," he agreed, "but it goes in the official record." He rode to town and it went in the official record, and the sheriff, a man named Cole who had the look of someone who had chosen survival over integrity so many times that the choice no longer cost him anything, took the report with a careful neutrality and did nothing. But something else happened that day. When Harvey returned from town, he brought with him 2 of the downstream farmers, brothers named Calloway, solid men in their 40s who had been watching Adelaide's fight with a combination of admiration and cautious self-interest. They had decided, the older brother said, that it was time to stop watching. If Holt was going to come after Adelaide Underwood's farm, he was going to come after all of them eventually, and they would rather stand together than fall one at a time. Within a week, 4 more farming families had made the same calculation. They organized a rotation, 2 men always keeping watch on the road that led past Adelaide's property, and they sent a collective letter to the territorial governor in Santa Fe, informing him that a court ruling in Harding County was being actively resisted by the subject of that ruling, who was using extra-legal means to intimidate the claimant. The letter was Harvey's language, Adelaide's content, and the signatures of 12 families. She sat at the kitchen table the night they finished it and looked at the list of names with something that might have been the beginning of hope. "You wrote that well," she told Harvey. He was sitting across from her, his jacket off, his shirt rolled to the elbows in the warm evening, and he had the focused, slightly tired look of a man who had spent all his intelligence on a single task. "Your husband had the instincts," he said. "I just know the form." "Don't do that," she said. He looked up. "Do what?" "Diminish what you're doing," she said. "It's honest work and it matters, you can say so." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I apologize. Don't apologize either. Just accept the thing." He looked at her steadily, and then something in his expression shifted, something careful dissolving into something more open. "You are a remarkably direct person, Adelaide Underwood." It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it. She did not comment on it. "I learned it from Thomas," she said. "He believed that most problems were caused by people saying what they thought they meant rather than what they actually meant. He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," she said simply. Another silence, different from the work silences they had shared. This one had a texture to it, a kind of awareness, the way air sometimes thickens before weather changes. "What will you do," Harvey said carefully, "when this is settled? When the water is restored and Holt backs off?" She tilted her head slightly. "What makes you think he'll back off? The letter to the governor helps, and Webb's report is already in the Territorial Land Office. Holt is powerful in this county, but he's not powerful enough to ignore Santa Fe indefinitely. He'll recalculate. Then when that happens," she said, "I will plant my south field. I haven't been able to irrigate it properly in 3 years. And I'll work on expanding the vegetable garden. And Eli needs a better schooling arrangement than what he's getting from me and from books alone." She said all this practically, as if listing tasks, but there was something underneath the practicality, an image of a future she had been afraid to imagine too clearly for a long time. "What about you?" she asked. "When it's settled?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands, that gesture she had come to know. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's been true for 2 years. I've been moving because stopping somewhere felt like it required an answer to a question I couldn't answer." "What question?" He looked at her with those steady amber-brown eyes. "Whether there was anywhere I actually wanted to be." The cottonwoods moved outside. The oil lamp on the table flickered in a draft from the window. Eli had been asleep for an hour, and the house had the quality of nighttime houses, held and quiet and containing more than it expressed. Adelaide stood and collected the cups. Her back was to him when she said, "I find that you have made yourself useful here." "I know," he said. There was something in the way he said it, not arrogant, but aware in the way she was aware, that this was a conversation happening on 2 levels at the same time. "That is not an invitation," she said carefully, still with her back to him. "I know that too," he said. "I'm not going anywhere, not because you asked me to stay, but because I don't want to go." She stood at the washstand for a moment, her hands in the water. Then she said, "Good night, Harvey." "Good night, Adelaide." She heard him take his jacket from the chair. And then the door opened and closed quietly, and she stood in the kitchen alone and allowed herself, briefly, to feel the full weight of how complicated the future had become, and how strange and unexpected it was to find it complicated in a way that felt, underneath the fear and the difficulty of it, more alive than anything had felt in a very long time. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that was peculiar and sustaining. Harvey stayed. He made himself genuinely useful in the physical work of the farm as well as the ongoing legal vigilance, because Holt's lawyers filed 3 subsequent challenges to the court ruling, each one requiring a written response. Harvey wrote the responses at the kitchen table while Adelaide worked the farm, and in the evenings she would review his work and sometimes change things and sometimes not. And they had the particular kind of argument that is really a form of deep collaboration, sharp and honest and never mean. Eli attached himself to Harvey with the thoroughness of a child who had been without a male presence for a year and a half. Harvey taught him to properly saddle and care for a horse. He helped him with his arithmetic, and then, discovering that Eli had an exceptional memory, began telling him history in the evenings, not from a textbook but from Harvey's own accumulated store of knowledge about the land they were living on and what had come before. Adelaide watched this from the edge of rooms and from across fields and from the corner of her eye, and she was honest enough with herself to know what she felt. She was also honest enough with herself to know that feeling something and acting on it were two very different things, and that she was the woman who had walked into the courthouse with a water claim when everyone told her not to, and she could be careful about this too. The rupture, when it came, was from Holt. It was a warm evening in late April. Adelaide was hanging washing on the line behind the house, and Harvey was repairing the water trough in the yard, when a rider came up the road at a canter. Not one of Holt's regular men, but a young cowhand she didn't recognize, who pulled up at the fence and said that Cornelius Holt requested a private meeting with Mrs. Underwood. Harvey was on his feet immediately, moving to stand beside her. She put a hand out briefly, not touching him but communicating clearly, and said to the rider, "Where and when?" "Holt's office in town," the rider said. "Tomorrow morning." After he rode off, Harvey turned to look at her with his expression of restrained but evident concern. "You're not going alone." "I wasn't planning to," she said, "but I want to be clear. I am the one who will speak." "Understood." Holt's office was above the bank on the main street of Redstone, a large, carefully appointed room that expressed power through its solidity and size. The furniture was dark and heavy, the windows overlooked the street, and the bookshelves behind Holt's desk held ledgers and land documents rather than books, which told Adelaide everything she needed to know about the nature of his intelligence. Holt himself sat behind the desk and did not stand when they entered, a deliberate discourtesy that Adelaide noted without expression. He looked at Harvey briefly, assessed him, and looked back at Adelaide. "Sit down," he said. "I prefer to stand," Adelaide said. "What did you want to say?" Holt's eyes moved over her without warmth or any personal quality. She had the feeling of being measured for practical purposes, the way a man measures a piece of land for what it might yield, not for what it was in itself. "I want to offer you a settlement," he said. "I'll restore 30% of the river flow. In exchange, you withdraw the appeal to the territorial governor and sign a document releasing all future claims against the Holt Land and Cattle Company." "The court ordered 70% restored," Adelaide said. "I will not accept less." "The court is a local instrument," Holt said. "It can be revisited." "Not without the territorial land office's involvement," Harvey said, and Holt turned his flat gaze to Harvey for the first time. "And who exactly are you?" Holt said. "Someone who has helped Mrs. Underwood understand her legal options," Harvey said pleasantly, "including her option to decline offers that are substantially below what the court has already awarded." Holt studied Harvey for a moment, then returned to Adelaide. There was a shift in his manner now, something that was not quite respect but was its nearest functional equivalent, the acknowledgement of a man who has learned to identify resistance correctly. "The 70% will put a significant strain on my summer operation," Holt said. "I imagine it will," Adelaide said, and her voice was even. "The 30% you were taking from everyone downstream has been putting a significant strain on our operations for 3 years. Thomas understood that when he started this, and I understand it now. If you comply with the court order, that is the end of it as far as I am concerned. No additional claims, no further action, but I will not take less than what the court has awarded." A long silence. Holt looked at her with that calculating flatness, and then, very slightly, he nodded. 60 days, he said, "as the court ordered." 60 days, Adelaide agreed. They walked out of the building and into the bright redstone morning, and Adelaide did not let herself react until they were half a block down the street and around a corner, at which point she stopped walking and pressed both hands flat against the wall of the grain merchant's building and took 3 slow, careful breaths. Harvey stopped beside her. He did not say anything. He was simply there, that particular steadiness of his, like a windbreak, functional and real. "Are you all right?" he asked after a moment. "Yes," she said. "I just needed a moment. Take as many as you need." She turned and looked at him. He was leaning against the wall beside her with his arms crossed, looking at the street with deliberate casualness, giving her the privacy of not being watched while still being entirely present. And she thought that this was such a precise and correct thing to do that it made her chest ache. "Harvey," she said. He turned and looked at her. She was aware of how close they were standing in the narrow gap between the grain merchant's building and the next structure, aware of the warm morning air and the sound of the street, and the fact that she had been keeping something contained for weeks, and it suddenly seemed both very difficult and very unnecessary to continue doing so. "I want to be clear about what I'm saying," she said, which was a very Adelaide Underwood way to begin, and something moved in his eyes that was warm and almost amused and very attentive. "All right," he said. "I am not a woman who confuses gratitude with other things," she said. "And I am not a woman who is looking for someone to solve her problems because I am capable of doing that myself." "I know," he said, "and I am aware that I have not known you very long." 6 weeks, he said, which meant he had been counting. 6 weeks, she agreed. "That is not a very long time." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." "But I find," she said, in the same tone she had used the night she told him he had made himself useful, that particular careful and honest tone, "that you are a man I would like to know for considerably longer than 6 weeks." Harvey Sheridan looked at her for a moment, and the steadiness of his expression was still there, but underneath it something had opened fully, some held-back thing releasing its breath. He reached out very slowly and took her hand, which was rough from farm work, and held it. "I was afraid," he said, "that when this was resolved you would have no more use for a former lawyer with no address." "I have been a practical woman," Adelaide said, "and I intend to continue being one. On a practical level, this farm needs more than one person to run it properly. Eli needs more adults in his life who care about him, and I would very much like someone to sit on the porch with me in the evenings." "That is an extremely practical proposal," he said, and he was smiling now, really smiling, that full, unguarded change in his face she had first seen in her kitchen 6 weeks ago. "I thought you'd appreciate that," she said. "I also love you," he said, in case the practical case wasn't quite sufficient. She looked at him for a moment, with those gray eyes that missed nothing and held everything clearly, and then she said, "It was sufficient, but I'm glad you said it anyway." He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly, warmly to his lips, and then she squeezed his fingers and released them, because they were on the main street of Redstone and she was Adelaide Underwood, and there were certain proprieties she maintained not out of fear but out of the same deliberateness with which she maintained everything. But she was smiling when they walked back to the wagon, and the morning felt larger than it had before. The 60 days passed. Holt, to his credit or perhaps to his calculation, complied. The earthen dam upstream was partially opened, the redirected channels reduced, and by the time high summer arrived the Rio Salado was running at full, restored volume past the Underwood property and the farms below. Adelaide stood at her irrigation ditch one morning in June and watched the water run through it in a clear, full, steady flow, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. She planted the south field, corn and squash in careful rows, the soil dark and well-watered. She expanded the vegetable garden, as she had told Harvey she would. The Calloway brothers' farms downstream were green with summer growth for the first time in 3 years, and this gave her a satisfaction that was deep and personal. Marcus Webb came through Redstone again in July, on his way back from another survey. He stopped at the farm for supper, and Adelaide cooked a meal large enough for serious company, chicken and fresh vegetables, and a pie from the first of the summer peaches. and the four of them sat around the kitchen table in the long summer evening, while Eli held court about the history Harvey had been teaching him, demonstrating his memory by recounting with impressive accuracy the sequence of land grants in the territory going back 40 years. Webb listened to this with the expression of a man genuinely pleased and said to Harvey, "You've got a good teacher's instinct." "He's a good student," Harvey said, looking at Eli with the warmth that Adelaide had watched grow between them over the weeks, steady and unremarkable on the surface, profound underneath. After Eli was in bed and Webb had retired to the spare room they had recently furnished, Adelaide and Harvey sat on the porch in the summer dark. The water in the irrigation ditch made a sound now, a steady, moving sound that had been absent for years, and Adelaide listened to it with quiet pleasure. "I've been thinking about something," Harvey said. She waited. "I could send a letter to the Bar Association in Kansas City," he said. "My resignation was voluntary and under specific circumstances. There may be a process to seek reinstatement." She turned to look at him. "Do you want to practice law again?" "I want to," he said carefully, "be able to practice law in the territory if not in Kansas. There is enough need for it here, Lord knows." "Yes," she said, "there is." And the water case established enough of a record that Webb has indicated he could write a letter of support to the Territorial Bar Committee. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You would set up practice in Redstone." "If I had reason to be in Redstone," he said. She looked at the dark water in the ditch. "Harvey, Adelaide, I think you should ask me properly," she said. "Not on a street corner between buildings." There was a moment of very warm silence. Then she heard him move and she looked, and he had gotten up from his chair and was kneeling on the porch boards beside her chair, which was a slightly ridiculous and entirely genuine thing to do, and she felt her heart do something large and unmanageable. "Adelaide Underwood," he said, "I came to Redstone with nothing but a horse and a satchel and a half-remembered understanding of water law. You gave me a cup of coffee and 6 weeks of the best work I've ever done, and made me remember that the law is supposed to serve people, not the other way around. I am in love with you in the particular way that happens when you admire someone completely before you love them, which I think is the only way that lasts. Will you marry me?" She looked at him kneeling on her porch in the summer dark, a former lawyer who had ridden out of the West and said she was right when everyone else was afraid to. And she thought about Thomas's cedar box under the floorboards and the water running in the ditch and Eli asleep with his arrowheads on the windowsill, and she said, "Yes, I will marry you." He rose and took both her hands, and this time on her own porch she did not worry about the main street of Redstone or proprieties, and she let him hold her hands and look at her in the summer dark, and she looked back at him without reserve. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. They were married in September, 6 months after Harvey Sheridan had ridden up to her gate on a travel-worn bay horse and asked if he could be of some use. The ceremony was held at the small church on the edge of Redstone, and the minister was a practical man named Hans who kept the service brief and the promises clear, which was how Adelaide preferred most things. The church was full. The downstream farmers and their families came. The Calloway brothers sat in the second row. Marcus Webb, who had returned to the territory for a survey assignment and was clearly not entirely surprised to receive the invitation, sat in the third row and had the look of a man quietly satisfied with how things had turned out. Even a few of the Redstone townspeople who had watched Adelaide walk into the courthouse with her water claim came: the liveryman, the hotel laundress, the young clerk Dobbs who had gone pale when she filed the claim and who now shook Harvey's hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had decided to be on the right side of history in retrospect. Eli walked Adelaide to the front of the church because she had asked him to, and because he had accepted this responsibility with the gravity of a 9-year-old who understood that something real and permanent was being decided. He had asked Harvey, the previous week, in a conversation that Harvey had reported to Adelaide that evening with his voice slightly rough, whether Harvey would be his father now. Harvey had said that he would be whatever Eli wanted and needed him to be, and that he would be there. That was the main thing, that he was going to be there. Eli had considered this and said that it sounded like a father, and he thought it would be all right. Adelaide, when Harvey told her this, had put her hand over her eyes for a moment and collected herself, and Harvey had put his arm around her shoulders and said nothing, which was exactly right. At the altar, facing each other in the bright September morning with the windows letting in the light and the smell of late summer through the open church doors, Adelaide and Harvey said their vows in voices that were clear and unhurried. And when it was done, they walked out of the church into the sunlight and down the steps into the gathered crowd of the valley community. And it felt, Adelaide thought, like something that had always been true simply being spoken out loud. The wedding supper was held in the churchyard, tables borrowed from half a dozen households arranged under the cottonwoods. The Calloway brothers brought a fiddle player, and there was music and dancing in the dust as the afternoon shifted toward evening. Adelaide danced with Harvey once, a careful, formal dance that became less formal as the tune went on, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist and the particular way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression she was still learning to recognize and intended to spend a long time learning further. Eli danced with the Calloway brothers' daughters and came back with grass stains on his good trousers, which Adelaide addressed with the brisk pragmatism of a woman who has made her peace with the nature of boys. In the winter of that year, Harvey successfully petitioned the New Mexico Territorial Bar Committee for reinstatement under good character, supported by Webb's letter, the court record of the water case, and statements from 3 of the downstream farming families. He set up a small legal office in 2 rooms above the hardware store on Redstone's Main Street. It was not a large practice. The work was mostly land disputes, contract disagreements, and the occasional water claim. But the need was real, and he was good at it, and the satisfaction of doing it properly, without influence or corruption bending the outcome, was the particular deep satisfaction of a man who has found his work again after losing it. Judge Prout retired from the bench the following spring, which surprised no one. His replacement was a man from Santa Fe who had no financial entanglements in Harding County and presided over the court with a straightforwardness that changed the character of the room significantly. Not perfectly, because nothing was perfect, but measurably better. Cornelius Holt remained the largest landowner in the county and continued to exercise considerable economic influence. He did not, however, attempt again to divert the river. Adelaide thought sometimes that this was because he had simply recalculated the odds. Harvey thought it was also because the letter to the territorial governor and Marcus Webb's official report had created a paper trail that made any future similar attempt both legally riskier and publicly visible in ways that had not been true before. It didn't much matter why, Adelaide thought. The water ran. In the spring of 1884, 2 years after the hearing, Adelaide Underwood, Sheridan planted her south field for the second time with a full irrigation supply, and noticed that the work was slower than she would have liked, which was because she was 6 months pregnant, and the particular combination of a farm, a 9-year-old boy, and a first pregnancy was not efficient. Harvey had begun rising before her to get the morning chores done, a thing she had told him firmly was unnecessary, and which he continued to do anyway, and she found she did not argue with it as strenuously as she felt she should. He had a habit, on the mornings when the light was good, of standing in the farmyard before the rest of the world was moving and watching the sun come up over the mesa in the particular quality of contemplation of a man who has arrived somewhere good after a long time not being anywhere good. And she had come out once to find him doing this, and stood beside him without speaking. And he had put his arm around her in the morning chill, and she had leaned into him, and they had watched the light come over the ridge together. Their son was born in July of 1884, and was named Thomas Harvey Sheridan, Thomas for Adelaide's first husband, which Harvey had suggested without hesitation, and Harvey for his father, which Adelaide had insisted on. He was a large, healthy baby with dark hair like Harvey's and gray eyes like Adelaide's, and Eli received him with the calculated generosity of an older sibling who has decided to approve of something, while maintaining the right to occasional complaint. Eli was 11 by then, and had been corresponding, with Harvey's help, with a school in Santa Fe that offered a more advanced course of study than Redstone's small schoolhouse provided. The exchange had begun as an exercise in letter writing, and had somehow evolved into an actual enrollment offer, which Eli was considering with the gravity of a young person making a real decision about his life. He would go, eventually, in the year of 1886, at 13, to a boarding school in Santa Fe that had been one of Thomas Underwood's quiet dreams for his son, a fact that Harvey had discovered in the cedar box letters, and had never mentioned to Adelaide until she found him sitting with the box one evening and reading, and he had looked up with a slightly complicated expression and told her. She had cried, not sadly or not only sadly, but in the way that grief and gratitude mix when they are honest. "He would have liked you," she said to Harvey. "I think," Harvey said carefully, "that I would have been honored to meet him." The farm expanded. The South Field produced a corn crop in the summer of 1884 that was the best the land had ever offered. The Callaway brothers extended their own operations for the first time in years. Two other families downstream who had been considering leaving Harding County decided to stay, and one of them built a new house in the spring of 1885, which was noted by everyone as a particular kind of statement. The following winter was mild by New Mexico standards, and Harvey took on a significant case for three families who claimed that a mining operation north of town was contaminating the tributary that fed into the Rio Salado. It was not a simple case, and it took the better part of a year, but Harvey won it, quietly and without drama, in the same county courthouse where Adelaide had won her water case. By then, the courthouse had come to feel like a place where things could actually be resolved, which was not how it had felt before the spring of 1882. Adelaide came to some of the hearings and sat in the gallery with Thomas Harvey, who by 18 months of age had developed a serious interest in rooms full of people and watched proceedings, with an intensity that Harvey said was going to be either a lawyer or a judge, and Adelaide said was going to be whatever he chose for himself. They had these kinds of small arguments frequently, which were not really arguments but a form of conversation that both of them found sustaining, a way of thinking out loud with someone who would push back honestly. Adelaide had had this with Thomas, the first Thomas, and she had not expected to find it again. The finding of it still surprised her sometimes, that particular quality of being fully known and engaged with by another person. One autumn evening in 1885, when Thomas Harvey was 14 months old and had recently learned to walk, and was conducting a determined investigation of the farmyard with the thoroughness of a surveyor, Adelaide was sitting on the porch steps watching him while Harvey repaired a section of the corral fence nearby, and Eli sat in the doorway behind her reading, and the sun was going down behind the mesa in colors that were almost unreasonably beautiful, deep orange and rose over the dark land. "Harvey," she said. He looked up from the fence. "I want to tell you something." He waited in the way he had, that quality of patient attention. "I was very angry after Thomas died," she said. "Not at anyone in particular, just at the fact of it. At the fact that we had built something and it had been reduced to a box of papers under the floor and a 9-year-old and a farm that was running dry." She watched their son make his way across the yard on uncertain legs. "I turned the anger into the water case because it needed to go somewhere useful." "I know," Harvey said, "but there was a point, sitting in that courthouse, when I realized I wasn't just doing it for practical reasons anymore," she said. "I was doing it because I refused to let the world be the way Holt wanted it to be, because Thomas was right and that mattered, and the rightness of it mattered more than the risk. "Yes," Harvey said. And then a stranger in the back of the room stood up and said, "I was right," she said, and she looked at him. "And I thought, that is an extraordinary thing for a person to do." Harvey set down his hammer and came and sat on the steps beside her. Thomas Harvey, across the yard, had found a stick and was examining it with total absorption. "It wasn't extraordinary," Harvey said. "It was just the truth." "Yes," Adelaide said. "It was. That's why it was extraordinary." She paused. "I was not looking for you. I want you to know that I understand what I have in you. I am not careless with it." He reached over and took her hand and held it the way he did, firmly and without performance, and said, "I know. Neither am I." Eli, in the doorway, turned a page of his book with the elaborate inattention of a child who is listening to everything. The last challenge from Holt's direction came not from Holt himself, who had settled into a kind of resigned parallel existence with the changed reality of the valley, but from one of his sons, a man in his 30s named Carter Holt, who had inherited his father's acquisitiveness but less of his patience. In the autumn of 1885, Carter Holt began buying up water access agreements from smaller upstream landholders, not diverting the river directly, which he had been made to understand was not viable, but creating a network of minor tributary controls that were individually too small to constitute a legal violation, but collectively represented another form of the same pressure. Harvey identified the pattern early. He sat with Adelaide at the kitchen table, with Thomas Harvey asleep in the back room and Eli at his schoolwork, and laid out what he had found. "It's clever," he said, without admiration. "Each individual agreement is legal. It's only the aggregate that creates the problem." Adelaide looked at the map he had drawn. "Can we challenge it?" "It would need a different legal theory," he said. "The approach would be to argue that the aggregate impact constitutes a de facto diversion under the established precedent of our 1882 case. I'd need Webb's input on the measurement side." They wrote to Webb that week, and Webb came in November, and the three of them worked for 4 evenings straight at the kitchen table while Eli, now 12, sat in the corner and absorbed all of it with his excellent memory and his father's particular brand of quiet attention. The filing was made in February of 1886. Carter Holt's lawyers were different from his father's, younger and harder, and the hearing was more contested than the first one. But the precedent of the 1882 case stood solid, and Webb's measurement evidence was even stronger than it had been 4 years earlier, and Harvey argued the aggregate theory with the clarity and precision that came from a man who had spent years thinking about nothing else but how to make a legal argument that could not be dismantled. The new judge, the one from Santa Fe, ruled for Adelaide and the downstream families. The tributary agreements were ordered dissolved. Carter Holt, who had sat through the hearing with a controlled fury that was younger and less managed than his father's, stood up when the ruling was read and said something under his breath that the judge did not quite hear, and then he walked out. That evening, riding home from town, Harvey said, "That is the last of it, I think." Adelaide looked at the road ahead, the cottonwoods along the creek in their winter bareness, the late afternoon light making the land gold and violet. "Why do you think so?" "Because Cornelius Holt is not a stupid man, and he has made the calculation by now that the cost of these challenges outweighs the gain, and Carter is his son's problem to solve. The old man will tell him to let it go, and if he doesn't, then we'll be back in that courtroom," Harvey said, "and we'll win again." She looked at him, at the side of his face in the late light, the lean, weathered lines of it, and the quality of someone who means what he says without needing to say more than is needed. "We will," she agreed. They rode home in the settling cold of the winter evening, and the house was lit from within, and through the window Adelaide could see Eli's silhouette at the table, and she could hear, even from outside, the small definite sounds of Thomas Harvey waking from his nap in the back room. Harvey tied the horses and she went in, and the smell of the house was fire and dinner, and the particular smell of home that she had kept through the hard years, and which had deepened and expanded in the good ones. Later that year, in the summer of 1886, Eli left for the school in Santa Fe, and Adelaide stood in the yard as the stage coach carried him down the road and did not cry until she was inside, and then cried for about 10 minutes, and then washed her face and went to plant the second round of the vegetable garden, because she was Adelaide Underwood Sheridan, and she was a practical woman. Harvey let her have the 10 minutes and the washing of the face and the planting of the garden. He did not tell her it would be all right because she knew it would be all right and she did not need to be told. He brought her water when she was working in the garden and crouched down beside her and said, "He's going to come back for Christmas and tell us everything he's learned, and we are not going to be able to get a word in." She laughed, which was what she needed, and went on planting. Thomas Harvey grew into a boy of considerable personality. He was dark-haired and gray-eyed and possessed of both his parents' directness, in a combination that was sometimes overwhelming for people who met him without preparation. He asked questions without cease, had an interest in anything that moved or grew or could be taken apart, and had decided by the age of 3 that horses were the most important things in the world, a position he maintained with impressive consistency. Harvey taught him to ride when he was 4, and the sight of the two of them on the trail road, Harvey on his bay and Thomas Harvey on a small brown pony, was something Adelaide returned to in memory many times in the years that followed, not because it was dramatic or consequential, but because it was the ordinary texture of a life rebuilt and made whole. The farm continued to be, as farms are, a source of both satisfaction and difficulty, weather and market prices and the endless physical demand of the land. There were lean years and good years, as there had always been, but the water ran, and the south field produced, and the vegetable garden grew along the back of the house in the systematic rows that Adelaide maintained with the same careful evidence-based approach she brought to everything. Harvey's legal practice grew slowly, and in ways that suited both the territory and his particular abilities. He was known for being honest, which in Harding County in the 1880s was a sufficiently distinctive quality that it generated its own reputation. Farmers trusted him. Families in dispute trusted him. He was not wealthy, but they were not poor, and the distinction between needing more and having enough was one that Adelaide had made early in her adult life and maintained with clarity. In the winter of 1888, when Thomas Harvey was 4 and Eli was home from Santa Fe for the holidays, and the house was full in the particular way it is only full when everyone who belongs in it is present, Adelaide and Harvey were sitting by the fire after the boys were asleep, and she said, "I want to ask you something." He looked up from the legal brief he was reading. "Are you happy?" she asked. He set the brief down. He considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to legal argument, which was one of the things she loved about him, that he did not dismiss personal questions or answer them with reflexive reassurance. He looked at the fire and at the room around them and at her. "Yes," he said, "I am genuinely, specifically, practically happy, not in a vague or general way, in the way of a person who knows what he has and is not confused about it." "Good," she said. "So am I." He reached out and took her hand. "I thought when you came to my gate," she said, "that you might be another man trying to take something. I know. And then I thought you might be exactly what you said you were, which seemed too simple." "People usually are what they say they are mostly," he said. "The trouble is that everyone is so accustomed to the complicated version that they miss it." "You stood up in that courtroom," she said, "with no reason to, no stake in it, no reward. You said a woman you'd never met was right about something that could have gotten you run out of the county." "You were right," he said simply. "I know," she said, "but that's not why it mattered." He was watching her with those amber-brown eyes, attentive and warm. "It mattered," she said, "because you chose to say so, because the truth needs people willing to say it out loud, even when no one is requiring them to." She paused. Thomas would have said the same thing, would have done the same thing. And you were not Thomas, and I was not looking for him again, but there is something in that quality, that particular quality of moral willingness, that I recognize and trust more than anything else." "You have that quality yourself," Harvey said. "You walked into that courthouse alone." "I had Thomas's papers," she said. "And everything else," he said. "Everything that made you the person who would do that." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she did rarely, not because she was withholding, but because she was not a woman given to constant demonstration, and that made the times she leaned against him the more precise and deliberate, and Harvey knew this, and had always received these moments with a corresponding quietness. The fire crackled. Outside, the winter was cold and clear, and the stars over New Mexico were brilliant, that absolute enormous starry dark that Adelaide had been looking at all her life. "Harvey," she said, "I am going to have another child." A beat of silence. She felt his arm tighten around her shoulders, that involuntary, genuine response. "When?" he asked. "Late summer, I think." He turned and pressed his lips to the top of her head, a gesture that was both tender and slightly overwhelmed, and then he sat for a moment in silence that was the silence of a man absorbing something large. "Good," he said finally, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "Yes," she said. Their second child, a daughter, arrived in August of 1889 and was named Clara after Adelaide's mother. She had Harvey's dark hair and Harvey's way of looking at things with patient intensity. And Thomas Harvey, now 5, received her with a mixture of suspicion and possessiveness that gradually resolved into a fierce protectiveness that was evident from the first month. Eli, 17 by the time Clara was born, came home for the summer and held his half-sister with the carefully managed emotion of a young man who has learned at boarding school to be composed, but who is fundamentally not composed about the people he loves, and who looks, Adelaide thought, watching him, increasingly like Thomas in the eyes and the way he holds his chin when he is deciding something. He had decided by that summer to study law. He had come to this decision over a period of years and had told Harvey in a letter before he told Adelaide, and Harvey had come to Adelaide with the letter and the slightly complicated expression she had learned to read as meaning he was feeling something strongly and was choosing his words carefully. "He wants to know," Harvey said, "if I think he has what it takes." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that what it takes is honesty and patience and the willingness to be wrong sometimes and learn from it, and that I had watched him for 6 years and he had all 3. Harvey paused. "And that I would be proud to help him study for the bar when he was ready." Adelaide folded the letter carefully. "You are a good man, Harvey Sheridan." "I try to be," he said. "You succeed," she said firmly, because she was a practical woman, and when a thing was true she said it without complication. The summer of 1889 stretched long and golden over the valley of the Rio Salado. The river ran full. The fields were green in the way that good water and good work make land green, the particular saturation of health in a landscape that had once been drying at its edges. The Callaway Brothers farms, the downstream homesteads, the small vegetable operations that had been hanging on in the bad years, all of them showed the change in their second harvests of the decade, the particular prosperity of land that has what it needs. Adelaide stood at the edge of her south field one August evening with Clara on her hip and Thomas Harvey beside her and Harvey walking up from the creek behind them, and she looked at the length of the field and the quality of the light and the mountains in the distance. And she thought about the woman who had stood in the county clerk's office with a rolled-up claim and fire in her eyes. And she recognized that woman and loved her, the way you love a version of yourself that did something hard and right. Harvey came and stood beside her, and she handed him Clara, who grabbed his collar with both fists and was immediately satisfied. And Harvey looked at the field and then at Adelaide with the expression she knew best on his face, that open, steady warmth that had nothing to perform. "Good year," he said. "Good year," she agreed. They walked back to the house in the late gold light, through the vegetable garden and past the repaired fence lines and the sound of the water in the ditch. And the house was lit warm against the coming evening, and the whole valley behind them was abundant and restored. And ahead of them were years that neither of them would perfectly predict, but both of them were ready to meet, together and capable and clear-eyed. The door opened onto the smell of dinner and the sound of a child, and the feeling of a life that had been built on true things, on water rights and honesty, and a stranger in the back of a room who had stood up and said that a woman he had never met was right, which she was, which in the end made all the difference. Adelaide Underwood Sheridan set the table for supper with the ease of a woman who knows exactly where she is and wants to be there. And Harvey Sheridan hung his hat on the hook by the door with the ease of a man who has found the place he was riding toward without knowing it. And outside the Rio Salado ran south through the valley in the last light, full and clear and unconstrained, the way water runs when it is allowed to go where it naturally belongs.